Good morning. There's currently a 277-meter Russian liquefied natural gas tanker, and it's basically just drifting aimlessly right off the coast of Libya.
Right, which is, it's essentially a ticking ecological time bomb that absolutely no nation wants to touch right now.
Exactly. Welcome to this deep dive into our source material. Today is the 27th of April, 2026, and the exact title for our briefing today is Med Sea Flashpoint, Migration Surges, Maritime Risk, and Libya's Instability. And we'll be covering the entire Mediterranean Sea region.
Yeah, and we are looking at a region where, these highly localized crises and global geopolitics are just colliding in real time. It's creating these shockwaves that extend far beyond the immediate coastline.
It really is. And, to cut through today's information overload and honestly the anxiety that usually accompanies this kind of news, we're adopting a very specific approach today.
Right, we are.
For the duration of this deep dive, we are embracing the ethos of a 1960s TV news broadcast. So think of that classic, calm, highly professional anchor desk. We are here to deliver the facts completely neutrally.
Our goal is not to generate fear or, take sides on any of this.
Exactly. We're just trying to impartially convey the mechanisms of the events contained in our sources to you, the listener.
Right, we're focusing entirely on the facts, analyzed objectively, to just give you a clear structural understanding of the Mediterranean landscape without all the modern sensationalism.
But before we really get into it, we do need to thank our sponsor, ProWave AI. This deep dive is generated by Stylo News, the AI-powered news application.
Yeah, and what you really need to know about Stylo News is that it's the consumer version of the Stylo Intel Ops software.
Right.
Which is a platform designed specifically for enterprise operations like government, military, major commercial logistics, that kind of thing.
Meaning you, the listener, are getting unique access to the exact same global decision-making tools used by professionals to track events in under 60 seconds. It synthesizes data from over 250 sources across 20-plus languages.
So our mission today is to structurally analyze the primary patterns of events in the Mediterranean over the past 2 weeks.
Yeah.
We'll examine the local, national, and international impacts of these events and survey the perspectives of the key decision makers involved, just to understand why certain actions are being taken or, ignored.
Ignored, yeah,
Yeah.
which happens a lot here. The most logical place to start is on land, I think, because the instability on the ground is really the engine driving the chaos at sea.
Absolutely.
And the core fact we have to establish is the deeply entrenched fragmentation of Libya. You have the Government of National Unity sitting in Tripoli in the west, and then parallel administrative structures aligned with Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar in the east.
Right. And it's not just a political disagreement.
No.
It is a structural divide. The central bank that controls oil revenues sits in the west, but the actual physical oil fields are heavily concentrated in the east.
Right, which makes our first piece of intelligence highly unusual. Our sources detail the recent launch of Flintlock 2026 in the city of Sirte.
Yeah, that's a massive deal.
It really is. It's a massive, multinational military exercise led by the United States Africa Command, and it involves over 30 nations. But what makes this historic is that rival Eastern and Western Libyan forces are officially participating together.
Yeah, they're jointly training to combat terrorism and, strategically speaking, to counter Russian paramilitary influence in the Sahel region.
It's genuinely staggering to see rival forces sharing a training ground.
Oh, absolutely.
But we have to look at the mechanics of this, right?
Yeah.
Integrating militias that were engaged in open warfare just a few years ago requires massive logistical and diplomatic leverage.
Yeah.
And that leverage, well, seems to be financial.
Always is.
Right. Our sources show a unified 2026 budget was just signed by 10 countries to support Libya's economic stabilization.
The budget is definitely the carrot, but the underlying political maneuvering is super complex. To bypass the persistent gridlock of, attempting to hold national elections, the U.S. is officially proposing a power-sharing agreement between these Eastern and Western factions.
Right. To form a unified interim government.
Exactly.
And looking at the mechanics of that proposal, it functions almost exactly like a forced corporate merger.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Imagine two rival companies, both with private armies, being told by an outside regulatory board to share the executive suite without ever allowing the shareholders, in this case Libyan citizens, to vote.
Yeah.
If this is a forced merger that bypasses the ballot box, aren't the local stakeholders bound to reject it?
Well, yeah, and that resistance is already materializing rapidly. The Grand Mufti of Libya has actively and publicly warned Western brigades to reject this U.S.-backed power-sharing proposal.
Wow.
Yeah. From his perspective, and the perspective of many Western factions, this is not a merger of equals. He's framing it as a Trojan horse, basically.
A direct, legitimized pathway for Khalifa Haftar's military apparatus to eventually subsume the civilian government and dominate the entire country.
Exactly.
I was looking at the online sentiment in our sources, and the divide among the public is incredibly stark. People aren't just reacting, they are deeply conflicted.
Right.
On one hand, there's a desperate hunger for the economic relief that this unified budget could bring. People need basic infrastructure, a stable currency. But on the other hand, there is profound active resistance regarding the lack of elections.
Yeah, the sentiment really reflects a localized fear that forcing this power-sharing agreement without democratic legitimacy just creates a temporary ceasefire among warlords rather than a functional state apparatus.
Which is a totally fair assessment.
Oh, totally. We have to objectively note that these contrasting realities, the immediate demand for economic liquidity versus the long-term demand for democratic legitimacy, are creating immense structural friction.
Yeah.
And because Libya lacks a unified civilian-commanded security force to manage this friction, the state's borders remain highly porous.
Which brings us to the direct cause and effect of this political paralysis. The lack of unified command on land directly translates to a lack of coordinated Coast Guard enforcement at sea.
Right.
The friction on land spills directly into the waters off the coast, creating severe security and environmental crises. Let's look at the Arctic Metagas.
Yeah, this is a big one.
This is a 277-meter Russian liquefied natural gas carrier that is roughly the length of 3 American football fields.
Massive.
And since early March, it has just been drifting off the Libyan coast north of Benghazi after suffering internal explosions.
The physical mechanics of an LNG carrier crisis are distinctly different from a traditional crude oil spill, too.
Right, because of the temperature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the integrity of those supercooled tanks fails, the liquefied gas rapidly expands and vaporizes. It creates an immediate, massive, explosive hazard and localized cryogenic freezing of the surrounding marine environment.
Wow.
Yeah, followed by intense fires that are, well, incredibly difficult to extinguish at sea.
And the response has been complete paralysis. Libyan authorities attempted multiple towing operations, but they failed. Our sources note that the extreme mass of the vessel combined with rough spring Mediterranean seas actually caused the towing cables to snap.
Just broke right off.
Yeah. So local salvage is currently impossible, but the real issue is international law. Because this vessel is part of Russia's heavily sanctioned shadow fleet, it's operating outside normal regulatory frameworks.
Precisely. Russia maintains that under specific interpretations of international maritime norms, the responsibility for salvage in a state's exclusive economic zone falls entirely on the coastal state.
Meaning Libya.
It's essentially a loophole in international maritime insurance. It's like a geopolitical hot potato.
Yeah.
Like someone stealing an unregistered, uninsured truck, crashing it onto your front lawn, and when you ask for help, the insurance companies wash their hands of it because the vehicle was sanctioned.
Okay. And you, the homeowner, are left paying to dismantle the wreckage. I mean, is the paralysis over sanctions actually creating a larger environmental security threat for the entire Mediterranean?
Well, Italy has stepped up, offering specialized environmental intervention, but only if the European Union officially requests it through formal mechanisms.
Right.
And the European Union is hesitant to act because intervening with a sanctioned Russian vessel sets a complex legal precedent regarding who bears the financial liability for the salvage.
Of course.
So the consequence of this legal hesitation is that a massive ecological threat is simply being left to drift.
And looking at the online sentiment, the public is terrified. The frustration is palpable. Coastal communities aren't just angry at the slow bureaucracy in Brussels, they're watching a ticking time bomb that could devastate marine life and local fishing economies across the central Mediterranean basin.
Yeah, and the Arctic Metagas is a passive threat, but our sources indicate the waters are also hosting active kinetic threats. The intelligence points to the war in Ukraine directly entangling North African waters. There are credible reports of Ukrainian drones operating from Libyan bases specifically to target Russian commercial and military maritime assets.
That is a staggering logistical feat. For Ukraine to operate drones from North Africa, They must have established covert intelligence and logistical networks on the ground in Libya.
Yeah, which is incredible.
The strategic goal seems clear, though.
Hmm.
If Ukraine can strike Russian assets in the Mediterranean, they disrupt Russia's ability to extract and transport African resources,
Yeah.
which are crucial for funding their war effort.
It just illustrates the complete interconnectedness of these theaters, and it complicates the international presence in Libya even further.
Oh, no kidding.
Just recently, the United Nations formally accused Italy of violating the 2011 arms embargo UN Resolution 1970. The UN alleges that Italy has been training Libyan armed actors, potentially facilitating the proliferation of military tactics to unaccountable militias.
The Italian Foreign Ministry firmly denies this, arguing they're operating under strict exemptions for officially notified training activities designed to build a legitimate Coast Guard.
Right.
But regardless of the legal outcome, this dispute highlights an impossible paradox. You cannot secure the Mediterranean without professionalizing Libya's security forces. But you can't train those forces without risking the violation of international embargoes designed to disarm them.
Exactly. And that paradox creates the exact ungoverned maritime space that illicit economies require to thrive. This directly facilitates the human impact of the region's instability, the severe migration surge.
Yeah, let's pivot to that. The statistics are sobering. In just the early months of 2026, nearly 1,000 migrant deaths have been recorded in the Mediterranean.
It's awful.
The scale of the movement is vast. The Libyan Red Crescent recently executed an operation off the coast of Tobruk, rescuing 404 migrants from a single vessel. And in another incredibly dark incident, the NGO Sea Watch rescued 44 migrants who had been stranded on an abandoned oil rig in the open ocean between Tunisia and Libya.
To understand how 34 people end up on an abandoned oil rig, you really have to look at the mechanics of the local smuggling economy. Human trafficking in this region is not an isolated crime. It is a deeply entrenched, diversified logistical network.
Exactly. I was reading through the field reports in our sources, and these networks trade human beings, utilizing the exact same routes and infrastructure they use to smuggle heavily subsidized Libyan fuel out of the country and narcotics back in.
Yeah.
Humans are simply treated as self-loading cargo within a brutal, multi-commodity illicit economy.
And the international decision makers are approaching this from heavily polarized viewpoints. Non-governmental organizations and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees emphasize the immediate requirement for unhindered humanitarian rescue operations.
Right.
Conversely, state actors like Italy and Libya officially view irregular migration as a severe breach of national security and border sovereignty.
And to attempt to manage this, the European Union is pushing a strategy called the Pact for the Mediterranean.
Right.
The mechanism here is a grand bargain tying European infrastructure investment and visa access directly to strict border enforcement by North African states.
Yeah.
In parallel, Italy is aggressively pushing its own Maritime plan, aiming to establish energy and economic partnerships to stabilize African nations at the source.
Yeah.
But looking at the reality on the ground, I have to question the efficacy of these top-down diplomatic plans. Can grand geopolitical pacts in Brussels actually dismantle localized, deeply entrenched criminal economies on the ground?
The intelligence estimates suggest no. There's a massive disconnect between Brussels and the borderlands. A grand geopolitical bargain might inject capital into a national treasury in Tripoli or Tunis, but it rarely penetrates the localized, ungoverned spaces where smuggling actually occurs.
Because in many of these coastal towns, smuggling isn't just a crime syndicate, it is the local GDP. Entire communities rely on the logistics of moving people and goods as their primary source of income. Until grand bargains can actually replace the grassroots economic incentives of smuggling, top-down pacts are essentially trying to legislate away a local economy without providing an alternative.
Which means the flow continues, and the local impacts are completely overwhelming the frontline infrastructure. Regions like the Italian island of Lampedusa and the Greek island of Crete are bearing the brunt of the geographical reality.
Yeah.
They're the closest land masses, and their local reception facilities are structurally incapable of handling the volume.
The friction this causes between European allies is significant too. Our sources highlight that the German government actively provides financial support to the NGOs conducting these maritime rescue operations.
Right, which causes huge issues.
Yeah, it creates a direct diplomatic conflict with Italian border authorities, who legally argue that the presence of well-funded NGO rescue vessels acts as a pull factor. They claim it incentivizes smugglers to put more unseaworthy boats on the water, knowing a rescue is likely.
And unsurprisingly, sentiment online remains highly polarized on this. The public discourse is sharply divided between fierce humanitarian advocacy demanding safe passage and urgent demands for strict border closures.
Yeah.
As objective analysts, we just have to note that this deep polarization prevents the European Union from forming any cohesive, rapid response regional policy.
Absolutely. And we cannot look at the Mediterranean in a vacuum. Let's connect these local flashpoints, the smuggling, the paralyzed ships, the fractured militias, to the broader shockwaves emanating from global geopolitics, specifically regarding global energy markets.
Right. The entire Mediterranean region is feeling the ripple effects of the broader conflict between the United States and Iran. The U.S. has claimed operational success in its recent kinetic engagements, destroying specific Iranian launch capabilities.
Okay.
However, regional security analysts are officially warning that this is likely a Pyrrhic victory.
Right, a victory that comes at such a cost, it essentially functions as a strategic defeat. The mechanism behind that assessment is fascinating.
It is.
Destroying an Iranian launch site might be a tactical win, but it does absolutely nothing to neutralize Iran's broader capability to deploy sea mines or utilize proxy forces to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
Because that underlying threat remains, maritime insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf remain astronomically high.
And that persistent risk of disruption sends shockwaves through global energy markets. It forces heavily industrialized nations to desperately seek alternative, geographically stable sources of crude oil to guarantee their manufacturing bases.
Which brings us right back to North Africa. We're seeing major Asian economies actively pivoting. South Korea, for example, is actively courting Algeria and Libya to secure emergency supplies of crude oil and naphtha.
Right.
They need the specific chemical properties of sweet North African crude to replace the sour crude they typically source from the Gulf.
This creates a huge feedback loop. The instability in the Middle East makes North African oil indispensable, which in turn explains why foreign powers are so deeply invested in managing the political outcomes in Libya. And this intense reshuffling of global priorities is resulting in brand new, highly unexpected defense alliances.
This is a critical detail from the intelligence. Italy has just officially agreed to procure Bayraktar TB3 armed drones from Turkey.
Yeah, that's huge.
For a major NATO and European Union power like Italy to shift its defense procurement away from traditional European or American defense contractors and buy directly from Turkey is a massive structural realignment.
It demonstrates a pragmatic shift. European nations are recognizing the technological maturity and cost-effectiveness of Turkish defense platforms, particularly in naval drone operations. Furthermore, Turkey is concurrently forming a new security architecture alongside Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt.
We're witnessing traditional regional powers bypassing the standard Western security umbrellas to build their own strategic frameworks. They're hedging their bets.
Exactly. So for you, the listener, trying to monitor this incredibly complex web of local crises and global shifts, the intelligence estimates point to three primary indicators to watch in the coming weeks.
Okay, what are they?
First, closely monitor the operational outcomes of the Flintlock 2026 exercises. We need to see whether this unprecedented joint training genuinely leads to the framework of a unified, civilian-commanded Libyan military, or if the factions simply return to their separate enclaves once the Americans leave.
Right. Second, watch the fate of the drifting Arctic metagas tanker. Will the European Union find a legal mechanism to circumvent the sanctions debate and launch an emergency salvage intervention? Or will they wait until the hull fails and an environmental catastrophe forces their hand?
Yeah. And third, track the shifting migration routes. Specifically, watch for sustained logistical surges toward Crete and Lampedusa. As the calmer summer weather approaches, it historically facilitates a massive increase in maritime crossings, which will aggressively test the new European Pact for the Mediterranean.
Thank you for laying those markers out so clearly.
To conclude our formal briefing today, we want to fully explain the technology that synthesized this analysis. Stylo News. Stylo News is both a mobile and desktop application that you can download to customize your own personal intelligence-style briefs.
And to explain how this actually works, without all the jargon, it utilizes a location AI bot and vector search technology. What that means is the AI doesn't just look for matching keywords like ship or Libya.
Right.
Vector search allows the system to understand the actual meaning and context of the news. It reads hundreds of traditional news sources and real-time updates from X and connects the dots, linking a drifting tanker to maritime law, to Russian sanctions, to local environmental fears, just like a team of human analysts would.
It performs the heavy lifting of global intelligence gathering, structuring complex data into accessible formats for your immediate review.
If you want to access the exact same caliber of information processing used by enterprise operations, we highly encourage you to subscribe. You can get AI-powered news on demand by visiting www.stylonews.com.
Awesome.
All right, dropping the 1960s anchor persona now. I have to admit, it's quite an exercise to just report the mechanics of these events straight without injecting emotion, especially when we're talking about human lives and ecological disaster.
This really is, yeah.
But I really hope this structured, factual format helped deliver a clear look at a very murky and interconnected situation. Thank you so much for listening and diving into the deep end with us today. Please reach out and let us know what topics you want us to tackle in future deep dives. And be sure to follow Stylo News on your favorite social media platforms.
And before we sign off, I just want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, connecting back to the defense shifts we discussed at the end. If traditional Western powers like Italy are increasingly relying on nations like Turkey for advanced defense technology, and if regional players are quietly building their own security alliances without Washington or Brussels, are we currently witnessing the definitive end of the post-World War II Mediterranean order and the quiet birth of a completely new, multipolar security architecture?